Part 1 of this series will examine the strategic and operational background leading up to the action during the summer of 1863. To truly understand the battles of Chancellorsville and Gettysburg, we need to examine the factors and events which led up to these battles. Many military scholars have repeated the maxim that geography is the bones of strategy. With that in mind, let's examine how the geography of the Mid-Atlantic influenced military operations in that theater of operation. The unique terrain of the Mid-Atlantic region, plus other man-made factors, played key roles in dictating strategic options available to both sides during the conflict. The first strategic reality was the relatively close proximity of each side's capitals. At just over 100 miles apart, each capital presented a tantalizing target, especially for Union politicians and newspaper editors. It was a constant source of worry for the Lincoln administration as well. The geography of the region generally favored the defender. For much of the war, this was the Confederacy. At first glance, the Mid-Atlantic area of operations is shaped roughly like an hourglass, with its neck just south of Washington. The eastern edge of the hourglass is defined by the Chesapeake Bay and the tidal Potomac River, as shown here. Controlled by the Union Navy, this water route played a role at several points during the war. To the west, the Appalachian Mountains form the other edge of the hourglass. These include the Blue Ridge Mountains and the Bull Run Mountains in Virginia, as well as the Catoctin Mountains in Maryland, and the South Mountains stretching from the Potomac in Maryland all the way up into Pennsylvania. The final terrain factor in the Mid-Atlantic theater of operations is that of the rivers. These rivers run from the northwest towards the southeast. The most important of these rivers in the operations up to and including 1863 are the Rappahannock River in Virginia, the Potomac River, which forms the boundary between Virginia and Maryland, and the Susquehanna River in Maryland and Pennsylvania. These rivers represented a significant obstacle for both armies, especially for the Confederate side, which did not have the pontoon bridge capabilities of the Union Army. Since both rivers are of a broad tidal nature in their lower stretches, fords could only be found towards the west. The Potomac is tidal up to the Great Falls, which is west of Washington. This is shown as the green arrow. The fordable points of the river, shown as dots, are all upstream of this point. Similarly, the Rappahannock is tidal up to a few miles south of Fredericksburg. All of the fords on the Rappahannock are upstream of that city. Given these obstacles, the seemingly neat hourglass is not that practical for operational planning. Confederate commanders were forced to maneuver to the west to use the fords across these water barriers, sometimes maneuvering outside the hourglass. One final wrinkle for the operational planners is the matter of logistics. The large armies relied on transportation to supply food, forage for the animals, and ammunition. Any army staying in one spot for any period of time would soon run out of locally available forage and food. Railroads were the solution to this logistical problem, but there were only a few railroads of use in northern Virginia. This forced both armies to make winter camp in a location near a railroad. With all this in mind, let's see how this played out operationally in the first 2 years of the war. Following the disastrous Union rout at Bull Run in July 1861, the country needed reassurance that the government could handle the situation. President Lincoln was faced with a demoralized army and trainloads of new recruits constantly entering the capital. He desperately needed a general who could restore morale and bring organization to the army. To solve these problems, President Lincoln turned to General George McClellan. Fresh from 2 minor victories in West Virginia, McClellan was the only Union general who could claim any success against the rebels. Lincoln needed an organizer, and McClellan fit the bill. He graduated second in his class at West Point and served in the Corps of Engineers for some time before leaving the Army to pursue a career as a railroad company executive. Supremely self-confident, egotistical, insubordinate, yet very risk-averse, McClellan would later prove to be a poor choice for a field commander. Upon arrival in Washington, McClellan set to work organizing his green soldiers. He immediately began to receive pressure from the president to do something. By the beginning of 1862, he was ready to make a move. The situation in March of 1862 saw McClellan's Union Army occupying the ring of forts which surrounded Washington. The Confederate Army occupied a blocking position in Centreville, Virginia, only 30 miles south of Washington, and at the neck of the theoretical hourglass. Confederate batteries along the Virginia side of the Potomac had effectively closed off the river to Chesapeake Bay access. McClellan's original plan was to flank the Confederate Army out of its position by moving his army by ship from Annapolis down the Chesapeake Bay to Urbana, Virginia, and then to advance directly west to capture Richmond. Two things forced McClellan to change his plans, however. The first was President Lincoln's insistence that McClellan not move his army to Annapolis, as it would appear to be a retreat in the face of the Confederate Army and might induce them to launch an attack on the capital. A move down the Potomac was the only route which Lincoln would approve. The second event was the sudden withdrawal of Johnston's Confederate Army from its advanced position at Centreville, Virginia, to a position behind the Rappahannock at Fredericksburg. This was in response to President Davis's insistence that the Army be positioned closer to Richmond in case the Union Army moved north from their beachheads along the Carolina coast. Union Navy elements, backed by Marines and Army troops, had successfully conducted amphibious operations in that area. Based on these considerations, McClellan modified his plan to incorporate a movement down the Potomac and a landing further down the Chesapeake at Fortress Monroe, which had remained in Union hands after Virginia seceded. The Union Army would then move up the peninsula and capture Richmond. Joe Johnston, for his part, watched the growing Union Army around Washington with unease. He knew that McClellan was going to attack, but where? A move directly south from Washington was a possibility, but so also was a water landing at Aquia Creek or even further south. When the small Confederate force outside Fortress Monroe reported the arrival of a large fleet, Johnston had his answer. Leaving a small blocking force behind the Rappahannock at Fredericksburg, Johnston moved the bulk of his army down the peninsula to confront McClellan. McClellan moved cautiously forward, convinced that he was outnumbered, even though his troop strength was vastly greater than his opponent. Johnston conducted a delaying operation in the face of McClellan's advance, looking for an opportunity to attack. He was repeatedly flanked out of his position and forced to retreat, however. Finally, as he reached the outskirts of Richmond, Johnston saw an opportunity. McClellan had his army straddling the rain-swollen Chickahominy Creek. 3 corps were on the north bank, and 2 were out of supporting distance on the south bank. Johnston decided to attack. In this battle, known as the Battle of Seven Pines, McClellan's advance was checked. General Johnston was severely wounded in the battle, however. President Davis quickly appointed Robert E. Lee as Army commander. Lee, unlike McClellan, had a realistic picture of the relative troop strengths and knew that he was greatly outnumbered. Recognizing that with the disparity in manpower, a long battle of attrition would result in defeat, Lee opted to go on the offensive. In a series of sledgehammer blows, known as the 7 Days Battles, Lee forced the Union Army back from Richmond. McClellan, at the end of these battles, was mentally beaten and withdrew to a defensive position at Harrison's Landing on the James River, protected by the guns of the Union Navy. With McClellan's army tied up on the peninsula, President Lincoln created the Army of Virginia to protect the capital, guard the Shenandoah Valley, and operate against the Confederate rail hub in Gordonsville, Virginia. To lead this army, Lincoln appointed General John Pope, who had some success in the Western theater of operations. As Pope moved towards Gordonsville, Lee reacted by sending Jackson to check Pope's advance. Occupying a central position between Pope and McClellan, Lee could operate against both Union armies. Convinced that McClellan would stay put at Harrison's Landing, Lee sent A.P. Hill to join Jackson. In a seesaw fight at Cedar Mountain, Pope's advance was stopped. As Pope maintained his position at Cedar Mountain, McClellan was ordered to evacuate his position at Harrison's Landing and move by ship up the Potomac to Aquia Creek. Lee, learning of McClellan's evacuation, saw a chance to attack and destroy Pope's army before McClellan arrived to reinforce it. Lee moved the bulk of his army to Clark Mountain and planned to flank Pope out of his position by moving across the Rapidan River and getting astride Pope's line of communication. Pope's troops, however, intercepted one of Lee's couriers with the attack orders. Informed of Lee's plans, Pope withdrew from his exposed position to a more secure one behind the Rappahannock River, where he was joined by reinforcements. After a few days of skirmishing, Lee recognized that he was outnumbered and was facing an enemy which occupied strong positions. He then decided to conduct a turning movement designed to force Pope out of his defensive line by sending half of his army under Stonewall Jackson, along with Stuart's cavalry corps, on a long looping march towards the northwest. Using the Bull Run Mountains as a screen, Jackson broke through the Thoroughfare Gap and attacked Pope's main supply line, the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. With his supply line cut, Pope was forced to retreat back towards Manassas Junction, Virginia. This was the location of the main Union supply depot for Pope's army. Meanwhile, Lee sent the remainder of his army under General Longstreet to follow Jackson's route through the Thoroughfare Gap. Jackson, alerted to Pope's imminent arrival, withdrew his corps to a concealed defensive position, waiting for the opportunity to attack Pope. When Pope arrived at Manassas Junction, he found a looted supply depot and torn up tracks, but no sign of Jackson. Pope desperately searched for Jackson's location. When a Union division moved past Jackson's position, he sprung the trap and attacked. Longstreet brushed aside the Union unit blocking Thoroughfare Gap and moved into position alongside Jackson. With Longstreet's arrival, Pope was outflanked. Other Union units were nearby but were slow to come to Pope's aid. After a fierce struggle, Pope was forced to retreat back towards Washington. Following this victory, which many experts consider Lee's most brilliant, the Confederate leadership spotted a strategic opportunity. In the east, the Union Army had been driven from the outskirts of Richmond to a position hunkered behind the fortifications of Washington. In the west, Confederate armies had begun an invasion of Kentucky and were preparing to invade Union-occupied Tennessee. The Union was on the ropes, Lee argued, and an aggressive push could force them to sue for peace. Across the Potomac was Maryland, a slave state which the Confederates believed was being held in the Union by force. The presence of a Confederate army in Maryland, they reasoned, would cause the people of Maryland to rise up and support the Confederacy. After a string of victories, Lee was confident that he could beat the Army of the Potomac on Maryland soil. This, he believed, would enhance their chances of diplomatic recognition by the European powers. Things were happening on the Union side as well. Pope was relieved of command, and his units were reassigned to the Army of the Potomac. Despite Lincoln's grave misgivings, McClellan was back in charge of all the forces in the Mid-Atlantic theater of operations. Screened by Stuart's cavalry, Lee moved his army back through the Bull Run Mountains and across the Potomac. To his disappointment, he received a frosty reception from the Maryland residents. This was the Unionist part of Maryland, and no support was forthcoming for the Confederate cause. Upon reaching Frederick, Maryland, with no evident support from Maryland's residents, Lee moved on to the second part of his plan. He believed that he could move into Pennsylvania and create mayhem there, while feeding his army on the harvest of northern farms. But Lee had a problem to deal with first. A Union brigade occupied Harper's Ferry at the mouth of the Shenandoah Valley. Lee needed this valley open for a line of communication. He could use local food and forage to feed his men and animals, but critical supplies such as ammunition had to be brought by wagon up from Virginia. Believing he had sufficient time before McClellan could get his army moving, Lee divided his army and sent nearly two-thirds of his forces under Stonewall Jackson to invest and capture Harper's Ferry, while the rest of his army moved to Hagerstown, Maryland, where it would wait for Jackson to catch up. With his army safely behind the ramparts of South Mountain, Lee used Stuart's cavalry to screen the mountain passes, backed up by D.H. Hill's infantry. Meanwhile, McClellan got his army moving and reached Frederick a week after Lee left. As the Union Army closed on Frederick, a sergeant discovered a lost set of Lee's orders which outlined the Confederate plans to split their army. A jubilant McClellan boasted that he had Lee just where he wanted him. McClellan should have executed more and boasted less, as a Southern sympathizer overheard the boasts and rode all night to warn Lee. McClellan moved his army to force their way through the South Mountain passes, Turner's Gap and Fox's Gap in the north, and Crampton's Gap further south. Despite a stout defense, the Confederate troops defending the passes were outflanked and forced to retreat. McClellan now held the passes and could move his forces into the Cumberland Valley to meet Lee's army. Lee's initial thought was to retreat south of the Potomac River once the South Mountain passes were lost. Jackson's report that the Harper's Ferry garrison was about to surrender changed his mind, however. He would offer McClellan a battle north of the Potomac. Lee scrambled to assemble as much of his army as possible astride the defensible heights along the Antietam Creek near the small town of Sharpsburg, Maryland. As the Union Army neared Antietam Creek, the Harper's Ferry garrison surrendered, and Jackson moved to join Lee at Sharpsburg. He left A.P. Hill's division to tend to the prisoners. In what would become the bloodiest day in American history, McClellan launched a series of attacks on Lee's army, starting with Hooker's corps in the north. These attacks were not coordinated, however, and Lee was able to shift his reserves to counter each one in succession. Finally, Burnside's corps in the south managed to get around Lee's right flank. The way to the Potomac River was open, and Lee would be cut off from retreat. At that moment, A.P. Hill arrived from Harper's Ferry and was able to check the Union advance. The day ended as a bloody draw. Lee, with his back to the Potomac and a battered army, could not risk staying in his position at Sharpsburg. He withdrew across the Potomac and took up positions near Martinsburg, where he received reinforcements. McClellan, despite prodding from President Lincoln, stayed in position, aside from a half-hearted attempt to pursue Lee, which was easily beaten back. Lee toyed with the idea of recrossing the Potomac at Williamsport and moving north along the Cumberland Valley into Pennsylvania, where he could obtain more supplies and possibly defeat McClellan in another battle. Realizing that his army was too battered to attempt such a campaign, Lee abandoned the idea. Finally, after over a month of inactivity, McClellan acceded to Washington's demands and decided to make a move. Rather than attack Lee directly, McClellan planned to move his army down to Warrenton, Virginia. Such a move would force Lee to abandon his advanced position. Leaving Slocum's 12th Corps at Harper's Ferry as a blocking force, McClellan used the Blue Ridge Mountains as a screen to move the rest of his army south. Lee responded by moving Jackson to a position east of Winchester and sending the rest of his army under Longstreet to Culpeper, Virginia. President Lincoln was finally fed up with McClellan's case of the slows. Lincoln relieved McClellan and replaced him with Ambrose Burnside, who had achieved success primarily in the coastal Carolina operations. Despite Burnside's protests that he was not qualified for the job, he accepted the position as a good soldier. Unfortunately, he would soon be proven correct. Whatever level his qualifications may have been, Burnside was certainly the unluckiest commander the Army of the Potomac ever had. Burnside responded to Lincoln's demands for action with a bold plan. He would sidestep Longstreet and move rapidly to the east to cross the Rappahannock at Fredericksburg. Two corps were set on the march and arrived at Falmouth on the north bank of the Rappahannock before Longstreet could respond. Unfortunately, the pontoon bridges which Burnside had ordered arrived over a week late. This gave Lee time to react, and most of his army was entrenched on the heights above Fredericksburg by the time the bridging arrived. Despite the fact that his plan to cross the Rappahannock by surprise was ruined, Burnside opted to continue his push south at Fredericksburg. This would mean a head-on assault of fortified positions on the hills overlooking the town. On December 13th, Burnside crossed the river using the tardy pontoon bridges and formed up facing the heights to the south. Sumner, Burnside's rightmost unit, launched a series of bloody and futile charges. Hooker, in the center, was ordered to support Sumner and sent units in before deciding that it was hopeless and calling the attack off. On Burnside's left, Franklin advanced cautiously, perhaps misinterpreting Burnside's rather ambiguous orders. The division, commanded by George Meade, hit a seam in Jackson's defensive line and gained a lodgment. Reinforcements would have split Jackson's line, but none were forthcoming, and Meade was forced to retreat under severe counterattacks. The battle ended as a colossal failure for the Union Army, with 13,000 casualties, compared to 5,000 for the Confederates. Burnside withdrew his shattered army back across the Rappahannock. Not content to remain inactive, Burnside came up with a plan to flank Lee out of his defenses at Fredericksburg. Leaving Sumner as a blocking force north of the river, he would move two-thirds of his army under Franklin and Hooker to the west and around the bend in the river to cross the Rappahannock at Banks Ford. On its face, it looked like a good plan. The move would place the bulk of Burnside's army in Lee's rear, forcing the Confederates to abandon their position and either attack or retreat back towards Richmond. In addition, the weather had been below freezing, and the ground was hard, allowing rapid movement along the mostly dirt roads. Unfortunately for Burnside, the skies opened up as he began his movement, drenching the ground and troops in torrential rain. This turned the roads into a morass, 1 to 2 feet deep. Movement slowed to a crawl as man and beast struggled to make their way through the mud. The rain continued for a second day, and Burnside ordered the march to continue. Finally, realizing his efforts were futile, Burnside called off the movement. This came to be known as the Mud March, and may well have been the low point in morale for the Army of the Potomac. Some of Burnside's subordinates began to express their displeasure with Burnside's command. Hooker openly complained of Burnside's incompetence. Franklin, hoping to see McClellan reinstated, visited the White House to insist on Burnside's removal. All of this found its way back to Burnside. An exasperated Burnside finally gave President Lincoln an ultimatum: either fire the generals causing the trouble or relieve him of command. Lincoln, realizing that the army was in no condition to survive a wholesale purge of the top command, decided to do a little of both. He reassigned Franklin and others in the McClellan cabal who openly advocated for Burnside's removal and relieved Burnside of command. In his place, he appointed Joseph Hooker to command the Army of the Potomac, leaving Hooker to prepare the demoralized army for the coming crucial campaign season of 1863. In the next episode, we will examine the combatants, the commanders, their armies, and introduce the main characters of the novel, The Loyal, True, and Brave. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Roads to Gettysburg. If you did, please be sure to subscribe, click the like button, and recommend this channel to others. For more information on the book, including a sample chapter available for download, visit www.gettysburg.com. www.robertjsweetman.com.